Today we talk about Covert by Kane Klenko. I played another game by this designer last summer, Fuse, a dice game, a cooperative dice game in real time. You have 10 minutes to complete your mission. Really fun. Covert has dice too, but there's also a lot more going on here. Fuse is mainly, not only a dice game. Here, well, the dice are used to fuel actions, but then there's also other stuff that you're doing. Covert is a game about espionage. I really am interested in this topic. I teach a class at IU which is about mystery fiction and espionage fiction, so I also looked in the history of espionage a little bit, and in general it is just a theme that fascinates me. In Covert, you control a net of agents and you're moving around Europe, moving with your agents, trying to complete various missions. You roll dice to gain actions, and then you commit your dice to perform certain actions to collect the elements that you need to complete your missions. This is the general idea. Let me show you how the game works. Here you see the board of the game. It represents Europe with locations connected by these blue lines. Your agents will be on these locations and will be traveling around. Here you see an area with numbers that represent codes that the players are trying to break. There are tiles that are placed on this display here randomly at the beginning, and players will move them around and switch them as the game progresses, trying to break some code cards, and we'll talk about those later. There you have an area where you will place your dice, because this is not exactly a dice game. There are too many actions in the game to really qualify as a dice game, but really it is dice driven. At the beginning of each turn you will roll your dice. You will assign them to various parts of the board. Then the players will try to crack some codes and score some of these cards. Then finally they will resolve the effects that are generated by the dice that they have placed earlier in the turn. But what are the players trying to do? They're trying to complete missions represented by these cards, and each card has different requirements. So when you see the name of a city, it means that the player is trying to complete that mission to score that card needs to have an agent in those cities. I need an agent in Palermo and an agent in Milan. There may also be a combination of cities and other icons. If I have an icon of this type, that means that I need to discard a card that produces that icon. I may need to have my agents in special regions. So there's a mix of things that you do to complete your cards. There's also a card that represents yourself as the leader of a net of agents. I really like how unglamorous these agents are, how conventional looking they are, because that's how spies must look. They must not look like spies, they must look like normal people. That's the point. They must be unglamorous. So you will have your own card representing yourself. Each character has a special ability. When you complete one of the missions, you turn it by 90 degrees and you put it under your own card. And now that mission may or may not produce a special resource. Some cards are simply missions, they don't give you anything. Some other cards give you extra stuff. For example, now I have this icon that I can spend simply using the special ability of this completed mission, and I do not need to discard resources. We talked about resources. The majority of resources that you use in the game come from these cards here. There's a deck of such cards that is placed by the board, and some cards are available also, and they are face up, and they are associated with specific colored regions on the board. These cards have three parts to them. One with an icon indicating a special ability that the card can be used for. In this case, for example, I can add a pip to one of the dice that I roll. There will be the name of a city, and I can spend the card to travel to that city, pandemic style. And then there is art indicating an object, an item that the card can be used as. So like this can be used to pick locks. And here you have pretty much three icons summarizing the information that you have here. In case the illustration is a little too ambiguous, then you have icons that do not have much ambiguity. For example, what is this? There's so much going on that you may miss. It's a recorder, so you have the icon there reminding you of that. Also, again, These cards here, they're used to crack codes. Each player will have several. When you complete one, you draw a new one. When you complete that card, and I'll tell you later how, you flip it to the other side, and now the card becomes this object here, which you can use again to complete missions, or you can keep until the end of the game, and it is worth 2 victory points as indicated there. The missions that you complete also are worth victory points. The number printed there in the top left is the number of points that that completed mission is worth. A great variety from 6, 7, 8 to much higher numbers. When a player has completed 6 missions, you complete the turn and you count victory points, and you determine the winner that way. Actually, after the last turn, everybody still has a chance of completing a mission if they have enough resources. Now, what happens during a turn? First, the players roll their dice. You have a reroll marker, which you can use once per game to reroll any and all of your dice, and then players will alternate placing their dice. The dice can be placed in one or several locations. They may be placed here in this area, in which case you will draw a counter from this bag here, and here you have tokens giving you various types of ability based on the icon on the token. As disadvantages can be useful. They're not the best thing that there is in the game, but it's good to get them in case you cannot place your dice anywhere else. You can always at least place a die here and get something out of this. You may place your dice here by that area which is used to crack codes, and that may be useful later. You can spend it later during the phase of the turn when players are trying to crack codes, but the most important area for placing dice is up there, in this area here. As you can see, there are those wheels where you can place your dice. If you're the first player to place a die, you can place your die on any number on the wheel that matches one of your dice. So I can put my 2 with a 2, that seems obvious. I can put my 4 with the 4, that seems obvious. But it is that obvious only for the first player to place a die on a certain wheel, because other dice that are going to be placed there must be adjacent to a die that is already there. So I could have played at the beginning any of my dice there, but after I played the 4, only a 3 or a 5 can be played next. And if somebody, which may be me, plays say a 5, now a 3 and a 6 can be played there. So you look at what other players have, because the numbers rolled is public information, and maybe you will do something annoying there, so that unless somebody helps them, then that opponent or that opponent won't be able to use a certain ability. That applies to all 4 wheels that you see here. So 3 places where you can place your dice. These wheels, the code area, and the general area that gives you tokens from the bag that I showed you earlier. Once all dice have been placed, the first thing that players do is to try to resolve, to crack the codes that you see here, and this is done by moving these numbers that you see here. You will have cards of this type in front of you behind your secret screen, and you're trying to produce the numbers on one of your code cards in the order in which you see them here. So basically I want 3 numbers here to show a 2, a 4, and a 5, or a 5, a 3, and a 4 in that order horizontally. To do that, each player that tries to crack the code gets a free switch. That is, you could switch 2 numbers in their position vertically or horizontally. You can also use the numbers the dice that you place there, to place them on top of other numbers, so to turn that number in the number showed by the dice. For example, I am trying to produce 2, 4, 5, and actually 2, 4, 5 in this case, I only need to switch that and I produce it. Hooray! But suppose that wasn't possible, and after I do all my switch and magic things, this is the situation, but I had placed a 4 in that area. Then I put the die there, and now I do have 2, 4, 5. All right, so use these dice to pretty much supplement the one free switch that you get each turn to try to complete 1 or 2 of your codes. You can complete up to 2 in a turn. After all players took a turn trying to resolve that mystery, that enigma, it is time to resolve the actions that you have here. For each die that you have there, you can move you can move your agents, any and all of your agents, by the number of spaces. This would be illegal unless there was another die there. But suppose that I do have those 2 dice there, so I have 2 dice here in this section here, that is the movement section. Then I can move any and all of my agents by 2 spaces. And actually I could choose to remove a die from there and move my agents by 1, and then remove another one and move my agents by 1, or I could remove both and move them all by up to 2 spaces. The agents move on from a space to another, following the interconnections and the lines that you see there. However, as they move, they leave information behind. So every time that you move, you leave a cube of your color behind in the situation, in the place that you just left. However, there can only be 1 cube of a color per player in a place, so if I'm to go back there, I would not put a second blue cube there. So as you move, you are leaving cubes of your own color behind, but you're also collecting cubes belonging to other players, cubes that other players may have left on the board. When you have 2 cubes of a color that belongs to another player, return those 2 cubes to them, and you get a free card, a free agency cards. Again, these cards that give you resources that you so desperately need to complete missions. So it's good. Try not to leave too many cubes around when your opponents are also around, or try to move your agents. Sometimes you do not find other ways of scoring resources or getting resources but to move your agents and collect enemy cubes, and that is a perfectly legitimate strategy. So that's for movement. Again, it may be counterintuitive. Each die allows you to move any and all of your agents. It's not 1 agent per die. In other games, the movement that you accrue from whatever resources is individually based. Here, that number of movement points is assigned to any and all of your agents. Now, the other action here, for each die that you have there, you can take an agency card, again, the ones that give you resources, from a region where you have an agent. Remember how I showed you early on? These cards here at the bottom are associated with cards. So when I resolve that action there, in this case, for example, I could take a card, the card is associated with the green region because I have an agent in the green region, and the card associated with the orange region because I have an agent there. I also have a second agent in the green region, so that doesn't help me much. So you can take those cards, those resource cards, but you have to have an agent in the right place. So maybe you will want to move and then you take a resource, or maybe you did take a resource and then you move because you do not want to waste the opportunity to take a resource. You need to figure out how to use that, those abilities, those possibilities there. Then we have this other action here, which allows you to get new missions. So when you complete a mission, then you need a new one. That's what the game is about. Or maybe you really don't like your missions, you got stuck with missions that you don't like, so you want to replace them, and that's when you gain new missions. Finally, you also will want to complete a mission. When you have all of the requirements on your card to complete a mission, say I do have an agent in Madrid and one in Lisbon, or I do have an agent here in Athens, and also those 2 resources they can produce, then it's not enough to show that you have the resources. You actually need to have a die there, and you spend a die, you spend that action to complete that mission. Then you spend the die, you remove it, you show the mission, you produce the resources, and you score the mission by sliding it onto your card through. And that's how Covert works. Roll dice, assign them to various areas of the board, try to get some of these cards, which can be useful as resources or points, move around, resolve those actions, complete missions. After 6 missions have been completed by a player, score at the end and see who the winner is. Component-wise, the game is superb. It is just, there's just so much love that went into this, so much attention that was paid to all the details. I don't know if you noticed, but for example, the connections on the board, they're not simple lines, but they look like threads. They look like threads that have been pinned to a map of Europe, like you have in movies when you see the detective that is pinning stuff to the wall and drawing connections, again, with little threads to show all the ways that the possible clues can go together. So you have that feel here. Even the font on the dice look like it had been typed with a typewriter, an old school typewriter. So definitely there has been attention paid to every single detail of the material components, the art, the design, and that is absolutely great. It really helps with the atmosphere. Everything feels very thematic and atmospheric. As for the game itself, the game is a good one. It's solid and strong and tight, which is a pleasant surprise. It was a pleasant surprise. I wasn't sure when I read the rules and I look at the board. In particular, I was a little bit skeptical about the display that you use to crack codes with those numbers. From the rule book and the board, it almost looked like an afterthought. It almost looked like something that would not go together with the rest. But in truth, after playing the game, I have to say that it feels very organic. It is integrated very well in the design. Thematically, that is obvious. From time to time, you're finding something and you're trying to crack the code, so you can look at the documents in there and then you can close it back so that the opponent doesn't know what you have done. Rather than just smashing whatever it is with a hammer. So it's very thematic. But game-wise also, it works well because, of course, you have to spend dice that you could spend doing other things. And maybe trying to get that stuff is not going to be your first option. You will want to spend your action doing something else. But sometimes you have enough dice already on the display for something else. I'm gonna move enough and I'm gonna complete a mission this turn, so I have an extra die, whatever, I'm gonna spend it on the display. Because it is true that in general what you get from that display from cracking codes is a card that gives you a single resource and 2 points, which is not that great. However, maybe that one resource that you get from your card is exactly what you need to complete a valuable mission that, gosh darn it, you have been trying to complete for the last 3 turns, and for whatever reason, somebody else is always grabbing the resource that you need. The resource you need is not where you need it to be. So that all of a sudden, that one resource, that one 2-point card that can also give you a resource, if you complete it by cracking the code, allows you to complete a mission that's worth 13 points. Now that's a different story. So the value, the relative value of the resources that you get as a reward from cracking the code can change vastly. But again, it feels very organic because that small resource will be valuable if you didn't get it from somewhere else. So bottom line, every element of the design goes well together. There are a lot of moving parts, and at first sight, they look very different from one another. And I'm sometimes skeptical of games that look like a collection of other games. But this is not the case. Everything is hierarchically connected and contributes to the greater good of the design overall. So that element feels connected, and spending resources, placing dice to then complete your actions, that is also very well implemented here. It's interesting choices, tough choices. Timing and the order in which you commit your dice is important because you're looking at what other players have and you want to make sure that you get to commit a certain action because you're afraid that if the opponent is going to use that dice and place it in a certain wheel, then you won't be able, with the dice that you have, to be able to add to that action. So sometimes there's timing involved because you think, oh, okay, what is the action that I want to make sure, absolutely sure I'll be able to perform so I can spend my die here. Because by the time the game comes back to me, due to the dice that the players may have played, I may not be able to do all the actions that I want. So timing is important, seeing what the opponents are doing is important, trying to figure out their plans and how they're trying to get in the way of your own plan. This is also all very important, and it adds interest to the game. It adds reasons for you to be engaged, to pay attention to everything that happens, to maximize the dice that you have. So there is definitely luck involved, so like every time that you roll dice, but this is fine because then there is such a large range of things that you can do with those dice. You more or less will always be able to do something interesting, and this turn I won't be able to complete the mission that I wanted, and my opponents are completing 3 missions each. That can't be good, but I can maybe collect a lot of resources and build up an engine or other things that in the next turn will allow me to grab a lot of missions, to complete a lot of missions. And there are different ways to go about the missions that you complete. Sometimes you have a player that manages to complete a lot of low value missions, which are kind of easier to complete, and they're just trying to bring the game to a conclusion as soon as possible, whereas other players have built fewer missions, but they're much more valuable. And so, of course, those players will want to maybe put down 1 or 2 more before the game ends. So you may have a player that has more missions than everybody else, and completes the game, and turns out at the end that the player is not necessarily the winner because there's maybe another player that completed fewer missions but high value missions. So the value of the missions that you have, how much you invest on each, and how many in general you want to go, you're going to concentrate on fewer missions, high value, or just a lot of missions and bring the game to a close before the players have completed the bigger missions. Different ways of approaching the game, very different, but they're both reasonable. They both make sense, and of course they make the game one in which you can go about winning in different ways, which is fun. More paths to victory means more options, means more approaches, more things you have to defend against, depending on which path the opponents have decided to go. So a lot of interesting decisions, a lot of interesting interactions that emerge from a game engine, which really is fairly simple, fairly linear. I mean, this is not a super simple game. It takes quite a while to play. It's gonna be the main game in a game night. I don't know how long your game nights are, but unless they are 18 hours, this takes about 90 minutes, 2 hours. Depends on number of players, depends on how much energy everybody wants to invest. But it is a fairly meaty game in terms of experience and strategy, while being in truth a fairly lean game in terms of complexity. So a good level of strategy based on a fairly approachable, very playable engine. The turns will take quite a while, but they don't feel long because the actions go around the table rather quickly. Place your dice, resolve them the next, the next one. Let's roll again, etc., etc. So the game moves pretty fast. We'll still having an interesting scope game-wise, an interesting architecture as players build up their resources, collect missions, and again, the combination of missions that you will collect will influence what happens next and how other players will decide what to pursue next. So if you're gonna end the game next turn, probably will not want to get started with some big mission or just to desperately score little things here and there. So a lot of moving parts, they go together well, the engine is strong, the experience is one that is tight, rewarding. Game-wise, this is a very solid game and one that I enjoyed playing. Covert feels fairly thematic, although I have to say the theme really seems to come mainly from the components. The mechanics, I don't know that they're that thematic, I do not know that they are that strong in narrative, but the components do enough to create a certain atmosphere around the game and to keep me involved in that department. But to me, what really shines in the game is the game engine, which gives me a limited number of actions that I can perform, but a large number of options in which I can spend those actions, and a large number of ways in which I can implement those actions. I can spend my dice to move this or to move that, to this, to that. Nice, really range of options. So it gives me a lot of interesting play options around the core that is simple, they're approachable. These are all things that I like in a game. Again, that keeps me involved, has a nice pace, has a nice progression. everything really fits, everything works. Covert in general to me is a very solid design. I recommend it to players that like Euro games, games that are ludically very strong. If you're looking for a theme, there are other games that tell you a stronger story about espionage. Agents of Smersh comes to mind. But in terms of just a good dice fueled game, not exactly dice driven, maybe dice driven is the right word, not a dice game but a dice driven game with a lot of interesting options but a fairly approachable game engine, then Covert definitely would be a good option. In general, a fun game that I enjoy playing.